Carter refers again to our work, but he also talks about now quite specifically how creativity emerges from interactional language encounters. And that's what I want to focus on in much of this talk. It's often, he says, contingent, is produced and co-produced in domains in which these new forms of social encounter we've referred to require the formation of different interactive practices and new identities. He goes on to say that at a critical moment in an encounter where in order to achieve a goal or to circumvent or accommodate emergent issues of problem or contention, professionals, for example in the fields of law and healthcare, use language creatively in relation to traditionally conceived modes of professional talk in their fields and move discursively into another discourse. What I think I would want to take out of that kind of commentary on our work is this notion of critical moment in the first instance, which I shall refer to much later, and this notion of achieving a goal, because this is the purposiveness that I'm associating with this strategic idea of a creative manipulation, a creative recreation and generation of new forms of discourse. And the idea of it being in response to emergent issues of problem or contention, perhaps put a little strongly there, but nonetheless certainly the case in healthcare and indeed in the law. I mentioned at the beginning that much of what I'm saying, and I put this in order to try to make a connection between not only work in discourse analysis, but also work in literary criticism, in work in art, and in other domains of creativity, to refer to Bakhtin's term. Heteroglossia is one, of course, we're very familiar with, this notion of texts of different kinds containing different voices. And central here is the notion of dialogism, how an utterance addresses not only a particular person and context, but also either explicitly or implicitly responds or refers to a previous person and context or voice. And I'm sure it's going to be possible increasingly in this seminar to see connections between papers. After all, this kind of quotation might well have been introduced in the previous speaker's talk, because essentially the previous speaker was referring to this notion of dialogism, or its lack of existence, in relation to responses of persons and organizations to particular contexts and voices. The important point here, I think, is that voices and contexts are often implicit rather than explicit, for, as I will show later, in the context of oncological consultations, the voices and discourses of medical ethics and the law related to informed consent are implicit in the oncologist's talk. So what we may draw from this kind of statement is this notion of directness and indirectness, this idea that creativity is somehow to be delved into rather than, as it were, immediately patent and apparent. And the other point, of course, is this notion of dialogism, the extent to which this creativity is a product of some unilateral performance or some bilateral and co-constructed performance. Again, we can look at the work of Sarangi and Roberts in their classic 1999 book, which has been partly referred to, this notion of a relationship between what we might call professional identities and the discourse and voice of shared ways of knowing, drawing on professional knowledge, ethics and codes of conduct, institutional identities and the discourse and voice of transformation and adherence to the conventions of institutional communities of practice, personal identities and the discourse voice of human experience, talking in my data with patients as members of the same world of being. Now, all three identities and all three discourses may co-occur creatively within a consultation, for example. Communicative expertise in such events may lie in part in the ability to determine at a given moment in the flow of the interaction which identity is appropriate and effective to foreground and which discourse voice to invoke. As Sally Candlin and I point out in a special issue of the Journal of Search on Language and Social Interaction, where we're looking at the relationship between expertise, discourse and risk, expert health practitioners employ a variety of voices polyphonically and creatively as the context and experts' shifting roles and identity warrant. So then, we're faced from a discourse analytical point of view with trying to accommodate what is in essence a dynamic and a creative relationship. And it is firstly about how we can accommodate structure to action, how we can creatively link activity types, discourse types, and the construct of strategy. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The way in which we can account for strategic interdiscursivity in talk, bringing up the notion of purposiveness that I referred to before. And thirdly, accounting for the creative way in which participants themselves demonstrate in a post hoc and narrative way their own perspectives on what we might come to call their creative talk. Let me look at a few examples now, and then I want to look very importantly at one longer interaction, because one of the difficulties that faces discourse analysts, of course, is that one's constantly making decisions and statements about snippets of talk, of extracts of this and that. And we very rarely get the opportunity, at least in published form, except perhaps in books, but certainly rarely in articles, to have a whole trajectory, if you like, of a particular interaction. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So here we have this first example, which is taken from a project that I'm working on at the moment for the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. And here you've got a patient with type 2 diabetes who's been resistant to making lifestyle changes to his diet. Previously in the interaction, the patient has refused quite categorically to see the dietitian that had been advised by the doctor. And we have the interaction. Doctor, would you at least try my nice dietitian, who's very sensible? No, no, not at the moment. I'll see how I go in the next 6 months. Doctor drops his head, raises his head to gaze directly at the patient. Would you give it in 3 months? No. 6 months? 4 months? No. And then he turns back to his computer where he has the record, and the patient laughs and says, "This is like sale of the century." And the doctor then laughs and said, "Worth a try." And then he said, "Because you're not ideally treated." Now, it would be nice to be able to present this recording, but it's difficult to do that within the ethics of the project in which we're engaged. The interesting point I want to make here is that you have kind of bargaining going on here. The bargaining, if you like, of a TV game show genre, but it's put to use to maintain the rapport in the face of the patient's resistance to the doctor's advice. And what is salient here, of course, is the last phrase of the doctor, because you're not ideally treated. And that brings it back, if you like, into the professional world and the institutional world of the doctor, previously in this excursion into more personal and interpersonal relationships.